Today, we're digging into the incredible chain of events, the decisions and the miscalculations that led to Guadalcanal. This was one of the most brutal and absolutely pivotal campaigns of the entire Second World War. It's really a story about how a string of victories can blind you, how a desperate counterattack can change everything, and how the unstoppable tide of conquest was finally, forcefully broken.
And let's start with this quote because it's just so chillingly accurate. This comes from Admiral Yamamoto, the very architect of Japan's stunning early victories. Think about that. Even as he was planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, he could see the danger ahead. He knew that a long war against the industrial power of the United States was a fight Japan probably couldn't win. And that fear, that strategic reality, is going to hang over every single decision that comes next.
So to really get how we ended up at Guadalcanal, we're going to follow this incredible strategic chess match across the Pacific. We'll look at Japan's big problem after winning so much, so fast, then their grand plan that went wrong, the disaster at Midway, and how the Allies grabbed that one tiny window of opportunity to launch a really risky offensive that would change the face of the war.
Okay, so by early 1942, Japan's success was just breathtaking. They had torn across the Pacific at a speed that terrified the Allies. But here's the thing about winning that much. It creates its own set of problems. Suddenly, the question becomes, what do we do now? And that's a tough one.
You see, while the hardliners in the military were shouting for more and more expansion, Yamamoto understood a terrifying truth. Japan was on the clock. He was convinced they had a very, very narrow window to land one more spectacular punch, a victory so big it would force the US and Britain to the negotiating table. He had to secure a peace before Japan's resources and, frankly, its luck completely ran out.
And that sense of urgency, that feeling that time was running out, led to a really fierce debate inside the Imperial General Staff about what to do next. Japan was at a huge crossroads, and the path they were about to choose would, well, it would seal their fate.
So they had three main options on the table. Yamamoto, his preferred choice, was a big move into the Indian Ocean to knock out the British fleet. But the army, which was already bogged down in China, said no way. Another idea was to isolate Australia, but Yamamoto felt that was just too slow. It wouldn't deliver that knockout blow he needed. So that left one option, a huge, high-risk, all-or-nothing showdown.
And so, the target was set. Yamamoto's plan, a really complex one, was designed to lure the US carriers that survived Pearl Harbor into a trap at Midway Atoll. He was absolutely convinced that this one battle would not only shatter American naval power, but more importantly, it would break America's will to fight and force a political deal on Japan's terms.
But what was planned as the ultimate decisive victory? Well, it turned into an absolute catastrophic defeat.
Just like that, in the span of a few crucial hours in June of 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Japan lost 4 of its large fleet aircraft carriers. These weren't just ships, they were the heart and soul of Japan's offensive power. It was an almost unbelievable reversal of fortune.
The loss was so staggering, so damaging to their strategic plans, that the truth was hidden from almost everyone, including many in the Army's own high command. This secret disaster threw Japan's whole timeline into chaos, but, and this is a big but, it didn't stop the operations that were already underway, like that relentless push south towards Australia.
So while Japan was reeling from this secret disaster at Midway, the Allies saw a glimmer of hope. For the first time, really, since Pearl Harbor, they could start to think about shifting from just desperately defending to maybe, just maybe, going on the offense.
Now, the Battle of the Coral Sea had slowed the Japanese down a bit, but the threat of Australia being completely cut off from its American supply lines was still very, very real. Allied command knew they had to hit back, somewhere, anywhere, to disrupt Japan's momentum and finally seize the initiative for themselves.
And this led to a debate. 2 competing plans came up. General MacArthur, he wanted a massive, ambitious assault on the huge Japanese base at Rabaul. But Admiral Ernest King, the famously aggressive chief of naval operations, argued for something a bit more practical. His idea was a step-by-step approach. Grab smaller, less defended islands first. And honestly, given the very limited resources the Allies had at the time, King's more cautious plan was the one that made sense.
So this new Allied plan got a code name, Operation Watchtower. And suddenly, it was thrown into high gear with incredible speed. Why? Because Allied intelligence had just discovered a new and very urgent threat popping up in the remote Solomon Islands.
It was like putting a puzzle together. There were reconnaissance flights and
this is crucial, intercepted radio signals that the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor were reading. And all the clues pointed to one obscure little island that most people had never even heard of, Guadalcanal. The Japanese were building an airfield there, and that airfield was like a dagger pointed straight at the lifeline between America and Australia.
And just look at this timeline. It shows you the incredible, almost reckless rush to get this invasion going. The decision was made, and just over a month later, the invasion force was sailing. The commanders on the ground were, to put it mildly, deeply concerned. They were about to launch a huge amphibious attack with not enough training, shaky logistics, and really thin air cover. In fact, the one and only practice run they had for the landings was, in the exact words of the Marine commander, General Vandegrift, a complete failure. But there was simply no time to fix the problems. The threat of that Japanese airfield becoming operational was just too big. So, ready or not, the invasion force sailed for Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, under gray, overcast skies, the U.S. Marines hit the beaches. And in that one moment, the entire nature of the war in the Pacific changed for good.
But the initial landings, they were a tale of two completely different wars. On Guadalcanal itself, the Marines stormed ashore and found almost nothing. The Japanese construction crews had been caught so completely by surprise, they just fled into the jungle. Some of them left their breakfast half-eaten. But across the water, on the smaller islands of Tulagi and Gavutu, it was a totally different and much bloodier story.
On those little islands, the fighting was absolutely savage from the get-go. The elite Marine raiders ran into a dug-in, fanatically determined enemy. The Japanese were fighting from fortified caves and coral ridges, and their absolute refusal to surrender, fighting to the very last man, was a brutal, shocking introduction for the Americans to this new, terrifying kind of warfare. On Tulagi, out of a garrison of 250 men, only 3 were captured alive.
Caught off guard, the Japanese high command at Rabaul reacted with stunning speed and ferocity. The fight for Guadalcanal wasn't just going to be a battle on the ground. It immediately exploded into a desperate, three-dimensional war for control of the air above the island and the seas all around it.
And this was the real shift. The days of swift, unchecked Japanese victories across the Pacific were over. This wasn't a war of grand naval chess moves anymore. It had become a brutal, up-close slugging match in the mud and the jungle that would grind on for 6 long, bloody months, and really define the attritional, meat grinder nature of the rest of the Pacific War.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question to think about. What was the true turning point? Was it the strategic mistake and the catastrophic naval loss back at Midway? Or was it right here, on this jungle-choked island, where the Allies finally drew a line in the sand and simply refused to be pushed back any further? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.